Imagine a noose, slowly, invisibly tightening around the neck of an entire nation's economy. For over a century, Kenya was held hostage by its own history. If you look at a map of East Africa, the port city of Mombasa is the ultimate gateway. It is where the ocean meets the continent. But to get goods from those ships to the inland capital of Nairobi, and further into Uganda or Rwanda, there was only one real option: a crumbling, rust-eaten railway line built by the British Empire in 1896. Back then, they called it the Lunatic Express, because it cost thousands of lives to build through the unforgiving wilderness. 100 years later, it was still driving people crazy. Trains on this old meter-gauge track crawled at an agonizing 20 to 30 miles per hour. That is, if they didn't derail, which they did, constantly. To understand the sheer scale of this commercial disaster, you have to look at the invisible tax it created. Because the trains were useless, millions of tons of cargo had to be strapped onto diesel trucks. These massive rigs clogged the A109 highway, turning a simple 300-mile drive into a brutal 2-day nightmare of gridlock, accidents, and bribery. If you bought a flat-screen TV or a bag of fertilizer in Nairobi, nearly 40% of the price you paid was just the cost of getting it from the port. It was a logistical tax that bled businesses dry. The country was hemorrhaging billions of dollars, and they simply didn't have another century to wait for a fix. Then, in 2014, China stepped in with a proposal that shocked the global community. The plan was staggering. The China Road and Bridge Corporation promised to design, fund, and build a massive 500-kilometer standard-gauge railway. A heavy-haul, high-speed artery slicing straight through the brutal African wilderness, and they promised to do it in just 3 years. Western critics called it a pipe dream. The geographical hurdles alone were considered financial suicide. But the engineers didn't just bring money, they brought a radically different philosophy of extreme infrastructure. Before they could even lay a single piece of steel, they had to declare war on the earth itself. The route between Mombasa and Nairobi crosses the Great Rift Valley, passing through some of the most treacherous geological fault lines on the planet. But the real nightmare wasn't earthquakes. It was something geologists call black cotton soil. This is a highly reactive, clay-like soil found across the African plains. When it rains, black cotton soil absorbs water like a giant sponge, swelling up massively. When the dry season hits, it shrinks and cracks open. If you build a heavy railway directly on top of it, the earth will literally heave and snap the concrete foundations in half. So, what do you do when the ground itself is your enemy? You remove it. In a display of brute force engineering, construction crews excavated millions of cubic meters of this toxic soil. They carved massive, deep trenches across the savanna. Then they hauled in millions of tons of crushed volcanic rock and engineered gravel, essentially performing a massive blood transfusion on the earth. They compacted this new imported foundation layer by layer, creating an unbreakable, shock-absorbing bed across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Once the ground was conquered, they faced an even more terrifying paradox. How do you drive a high-speed, heavy industrial machine through the heart of the Tsavo National Park without destroying one of the most fragile and vital ecosystems on Earth? You are building in the territory of the Big Five: lions, rhinos, and massive herds of migrating elephants. You cannot simply build a wall and cut their ancestral migration routes in half. That would cause an ecological collapse. The solution was a masterclass in environmental engineering. The Chinese engineers mapped out the historical migration patterns of the wildlife. Wherever the tracks intersected with a major animal highway, they didn't build a crossing. They lifted the entire railway into the sky. They designed towering viaducts, calculating the exact height of a fully grown adult giraffe, ensuring the concrete pillars were tall enough for the giants of the savannah to pass underneath without even ducking. But they went further. Trains are deafeningly loud. To prevent the noise from terrorizing the animals, engineers installed advanced acoustic dampening barriers along the elevated tracks. They even painted the massive concrete pillars with specific red soil pigments, camouflaging them to blend perfectly into the natural landscape. They ensured that the true masters of the savannah could migrate beneath the screaming trains, completely undisturbed. With the earth stabilized and the wildlife protected, it was time to unleash the symphony of steel. Laying 500 kilometers of track in 3 years requires a pace that humans alone cannot achieve. So they brought in the monsters. Imagine a machine the size of a skyscraper laid entirely on its side. This is the track-laying machine. It creeps forward like a mechanical centipede. Inside massive temporary factories, workers precast gigantic T-shaped concrete beams, each weighing hundreds of tons. The track layer grabs these massive beams, rolls forward over the empty void, and drops them perfectly into place. Click, move forward, click, move forward. It was a relentless, unstoppable assembly line, operating in the middle of nowhere. And then comes the rails. To allow trains to run at high speeds with massive cargo loads, you cannot have normal bolted-together tracks. The clicking sound you hear on old trains, that is the sound of weakness. Instead, they used a terrifying, visceral process called thermit welding. Workers place a crucible over the joint where two steel rails meet. They ignite a chemical mixture of aluminum powder and iron oxide. In seconds, the temperature violently spikes to over 2,500 degrees Celsius. The reaction creates a glowing, molten river of liquid iron that pours directly into the microscopic gap between the tracks. The metal melts into itself. When it cools, under the crushing force of heavy grinders, the two rails become one single, continuous atom structure. They repeated this violent, fiery process thousands of times. The result? A perfectly seamless, flawlessly smooth line of steel stretching for 500 kilometers. No gaps, no weak points, just pure, locked-in speed. In May 2017, right on schedule, the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway officially opened. The impact was instantaneous, and it completely rewired the commercial logic of East Africa. That grueling, 24-hour nightmare journey, it was instantly crushed to just 4.5 hours. The port of Mombasa, once choked by its own inefficiency, began clearing cargo at record speeds. Freight trains carrying over 200 shipping containers each began hurtling across the savannah, replacing thousands of heavily polluting diesel trucks. But if you zoom out from the billions of dollars and look at the micro level, the true return on investment is profoundly human. For the world's superpowers, this project is often debated as a geopolitical chess move, a symbol of China's Belt and Road Initiative expanding its influence. But if you ask a local entrepreneur in Nairobi, they don't care about the geopolitics. They care that their logistics costs just dropped by 30%. They care that a local farmer's fresh produce can actually reach the coastal markets before it rots in the sun. They care that a mother can now safely board a clean, modern train and cross the entire country to see her family before dinner. Infrastructure is never just about concrete and steel, it is the physical manifestation of time. By replacing a decaying, century-old nightmare with a masterpiece of extreme engineering, they didn't just conquer the wild, they handed an entire nation millions of hours of stolen time back. They gave millions of people the tools they desperately needed to finally control their own economic destiny. What do you think? Is extreme infrastructure the only way to unlock the developing world? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you love decoding the commercial logic behind the world's biggest mega projects, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.